You're listening to Jay's Analysis, integrating film, philosophy, geopolitics, literature, history, economics, intrigue, and espionage, only at jaysanalysis.com. And now, Jay's Analysis Podcast, with your host, Jay Dyer. Listening to Jay's Analysis. Tonight, something a little bit different. I have with me, her name is Nina Kouprianova. Did I say that right, Nina?
Yes, you did actually. You're one of the only people who's pronounced it correctly.
Well, I heard the RT clip, so I was trying to make sure I figured she said it right, so I was going to try to mimic her. But so Nina is a student of history. She has a PhD in history. And I thought she would be a great guest because she also contributes quite a few excellent pieces and translations to both Soul of the East and Espionage History Archive that I contribute to, along with Mark Hacker. That's pretty much, I guess, Mark's baby there. And Nina contributes as well. And she's done some stuff on her own, I guess, she does the blog Nina Byzantina. A lot of good articles there. And I thought it would be a good conversation. So, Nina, why don't you tell us a little bit about you and your background and what got you into the subjects that you've chosen to focus on?
Well, once upon a time, there was a little girl who was born in Moscow in the late USSR, and I'm going to stop talking about myself in the third person. I've had a great childhood, but then the USSR dissolved in 1991, and people in sciences no longer had state funding to continue working, and that was the case with my parents as with thousands and thousands of other people. So there was a lot of brain drain from Russia and the former Soviet Union in the 90s, and I'm one of those very typical cases. So my formative identity is Russian, but I've gone to high school and university in North America. I know there's a lot of sort of autodidactic type people in the field of alternative media, but I do mention my education because I often get asked on Twitter specifically, where I'm pretty active, who the hell are you? And, what qualifications do you have to say what you say? So in that sense, I do mention the fact that I have a PhD in history from the University of Toronto, and my specializations are modern Russian history, the history of modern U.S. foreign policy, and culture. So it's kind of spread out and diverse. So that's kind of where I'm coming from. However, I've chosen not to pursue a typical academic career for several reasons. As I'm sure you're aware, in North America, there is, of course, this huge college bubble. Right. And lots of people are graduating with masters nowadays. A master's is almost like a bachelor's from, 30 years ago.
Exactly.
Consequently, a PhD is like a master's. So in terms of, just very basic economic reasons, getting employment is not easy. You're probably going to move around from state to state or provinces in Canada every 6 months, not getting paid that much if you're in the humanities. Then, of course, there's the cultural component. We're all kind of laughing about the way that young adults in university are being treated as children, with trigger warnings, safe spaces, and those kinds of things. So it's very difficult, I think, for newer people entering the academia professionally to deal with that kind of a stifling environment, which, some have described as a liberal totalitarianism. And then, of course, from the Russian perspective, Russia being a geopolitical opponent of certain NATO countries, you are being taught and are expected to teach historic subjects in a very specific way. And it's very hard to kind of stray outside of that. So all of these sort of reasons are why I've decided to pursue things on my own and, do translations for small publishers and kind of continue pursuing intellectual subjects without having that framework and that pressure of the traditional academia. So,
yeah, that's pretty much was my experience. I wanted to get a PhD as well, and I decided to just forget that because I was, racking up all this debt for a field in which none of the philosophy corporations were hiring. That's the
right.
going joke.
So have you gone as far as a master's, or?
Well, I got right to the end. I was working on my master's thesis, and I had a radical Marxist head of the department, and we actually ended up almost in a fist fight.
Right.
So I just left and decided I could actually probably be more successful just doing my own thing, which is what I'm doing now. So
precisely. What was your subject out of the question in terms of like the actual academic phrasing?
Do you mean what my degree was?
Well, your thesis, for instance. What was this?
It was on semiotics in Ian Fleming. So Ian Fleming's use of propaganda and James Bond, and I was actually pretty critical of Bond and the whole Western ethos. But that still wasn't good enough because it wasn't really discovered about what I was presenting in this paper. It was more of a question of what kind of a attitude are you going to bring into the academic clique, and it's very much a clique. And if you're not on board with, as you called it accurately, the liberal totalitarianism, you're not really going to be welcomed into that clique. And I was very naive when I was doing undergrad, and I thought, I was very idealistic, thinking I'm into this, get a PhD, but it's not. It doesn't really function that way. I mean, you could get a PhD, and you probably could find some university position somewhere. But again, as you said, all those kind of bloated nature of the degree system.
Right. I mean, at this point, if you are pursuing it, is in humanities. Sciences are a little bit different.
Right.
You kind of have to think of it as this additional, feather in the hat, so to speak, that will likely not bring you recognition or financial stability, unless, of course, you're doing a very popular subject. In humanities, it can be a certain group that's perceived as a victim group, and if that's what you're pursuing, you might, very well move up the academic ladder pretty fast. But if you're doing something, pardon me,
I'm a white male though, so
yeah,
there's not much preference given to the white man, unless if you do something like African American studies, women's studies, which I do know white males that have done that and found university jobs, but you pretty much have to be a complete floppy hand, if you know what I mean.
Right. Yeah. Well, in my experience, I've made the mistake of blogging under my own name when I was still in the middle of doing my comprehensive examinations and doing the coursework and writing the PhD. Right. And I wasn't blogging about anything dramatically, politically incorrect, but this was Canada. And one of the blogs that I wrote was basically about the history of pro-natalist policies in the Soviet Union and in contemporary Russia. And that someone decided to Google that, and I've had a little bit of a persecution going on behind my back for at least a month, with higher-ups meeting and discussing how terrible I am.
Yes, that's what.
And I've had a little bit of a, thinly veiled threat from a professor that I was working for, doing TAing and teaching tutorials and stuff like that, where he said that they might not allow me to defend my PhD if I proceed. And I've actually did stop blogging at that point because I've gone so far and I just wanted to complete it and graduate. And one of the points of contention was the fact that I was literally describing the historic Soviet posters that were present in this blog. And the children depicted in these posters promoting, pro-natalist policies were blonde. So when I said there are blonde children in these posters, this was perceived as you can imagine, a potentially racist comment. So this is what this is what kind of started this whole thing. So I've learned, being very naive as well, pretty quickly that things can escalate very seriously, even if you're doing something that is accurate and historically justifiable, and in fact, literally describing visuals. Yeah. So that was my experience too, which kind of turned me towards thinking that I should pursue my own thing.
Amen to that. Yeah, things that you would assume would be not even controversial are thrust into the realm of the controversial with basically no basis, rather just the prejudices and presuppositions of the academic class. And
right. Well, this is where, translation is, things that Mark does, and I kind of do my own thing, but we overlap a lot in terms of our interests. This is where it kind of provides you this intellectual outlet, and at the same time, if you're doing shorter sort of blog length or article length pieces, you get the sort of the satisfaction of providing this previously inaccessible text to an audience of, interested people, and at the same time, you're sort of challenging yourself. So that's where my interest in translation comes in. I mean, I've certainly, even when I was writing my doctoral thesis, I've had to do a lot of translation of archival documents that I worked with in Moscow, and even, things like 1920s Soviet poetry. So I've done really kind of varied and diverse things. I think my biggest work to date was translating one of the first volume of Alexander Dugin's series on German philosopher Martin Heidegger, whom many believe to be probably one of the most difficult philosophers to discern.
Right.
So that's something that's come out a couple of years ago, and I'm sort of proud of being able to translate that and bring it to kind of a wider audience that obviously is still very limited considering the subject. But I do a lot of spy text for Mark Hacker too. So
right, yeah, that's impressive. I had a good talk with Professor Dugin, and we got into some of the same subject matter that I think you and I will probably touch on today. So let's talk about. Before we get into the pieces that you've done that I'd like to discuss and promote, what did you do in terms of your thesis? It's on, I guess, Russian history, and what exactly?
Well, I basically decided to be very benign and inoffensive, thinking that this will help me graduate. So I focused on 1920s Soviet consumer advertising, believe it or not, after the Bolshevik Revolution. For the first 10 years, there was actually not only public but also private advertising. But this was all done kind of in the context of high modernity. So, things that pertain to the world of art, but at the same time have to do with broader historic currents, are kind of like what I tried to do instead of going after something that would be a hotter topic, something dealing with Stalin, for instance, that's more sellable. So, and I also I've always oscillated between the world of art and the academia. So I've done, my initial degrees are in photography and graphic design, and that's kind of a lot of what I do professionally. So this was kind of a way of merging the two, and at the same time making it benign and inoffensive sufficiently to be able to graduate for strategic reasons. I mean, to be perfectly honest.
Yeah, that reminds me of a movie. I don't know if you've seen it, but it's called Branded, by chance. Are you familiar with that?
It sounds actually kind of familiar, but I'm not sure if I've seen that. I've seen some, I've seen like the Helvetica documentary, for instance, on, the history of typography. So I don't know if you're talking about a fictional film or...
Yeah, it's a bizarre fictional, I think it's Russian-made film, but it's from, I think, 2012 or so. And the story is roughly this guy who kind of is lured into working for Western NGOs, and he's doing something that's roughly associated with the CIA, and he's very much into advertising, and his model for advertising in capitalist Russia is going to be modeled on Lenin. So he sees Lenin as actually a brilliant advertising executive, so to speak. So he models his whole approach to corporate strategy on Lenin. And anyway, it turns into this very bizarre spiritual battle, kind of Eurasian versus Western spirituality. It's very strange, but it just made me think of what you were talking about. And I saw a documentary not too long ago as well that dealt with the similarities between sort of mass corporate advertising and the structure of advertising that was done in the Soviet Union. So just two things that made me think of, but you might like Branded. I think it's a pretty good movie.
Yeah, I'm actually Googling it as we're speaking, and it sounds like it's a it says Russia and the United States. It was probably a kind of a joint effort type film, so I'll definitely check it out.
Yeah, Western critics didn't like it, I think, because it was very critical of Western thought. But
right.
It makes a lot of interesting.
And can't criticize consumer culture too much because you're selling it through each film. So
exactly. Yeah, your Twitter smartassness is pretty awesome. I've enjoyed your Twitter retorts to all of these Western types, and I think that's great. The way that you really, I think, with logical precision, criticize the Western media approach to pretty much all of these questions that come up geopolitically. So,
right, thank you.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, I tried to. This was kind of funny because I am one of the last people to jump on any social network. I came to Facebook very late, and I came to Twitter late, and in fact, I only registered because I wanted to tweet philosophical quotes that are of interest to me, believe it or not, and some of my photography. And then came the regime change in Ukraine, and I've realized that I can use this medium for, disseminating information that was simply not getting through. And of course, at the same time, when you're dealing with such a hot subject that is on, every newscast, you're getting attacked, and at the same time, you're gaining an audience.
Right.
So it's been kind of interesting to me because I do not vlog as regularly as I'd like. Due to my other pursuits, I do not have a podcast. I do not make video blogs, even though I'd like to. And nonetheless, I've been able to amass an audience who seems to be interested in my view of things. So Twitter has definitely been a fantastic medium.
Let's start with the piece that you did pertaining to Hitler's plot to assassinate Stalin. Now, I've actually referenced this in quite a few interviews and podcasts because you talk about SMERSH. And since I did my thesis work in Ian Fleming and James Bond, Fleming, of course, borrowed the original nefarious organization in his portrayals
right.
from reality. So how does SMERSH fit into this translation that you did that I understand is a declassified FSB document about the plot to assassinate Stalin?
This was actually an article written by kind of a regional journalist that was using some declassified information. And it was written in kind of a very nice and literary way, at the same time kind of targeting a popular audience. I mean, if you actually read the piece, it sounds like it would make a fantastic either film or at least a television show because it kind of had all the right components.
Right.
In regard to SMERSH or SMERSH as we pronounce it, it's basically a counterintelligence organization that functioned in World War II, and the abbreviation basically stands for death to spies. So it was a pretty, interesting and a hardcore organization. And what that piece was about was basically the, spy versus spy games during World War II going to the highest levels, as you've mentioned. It was about plot to assassinate, Stalin himself. And what was interesting about it is the fact that it kind of, in the way that the author wrote this piece, pitted this young, up-and-coming officer who was actually from what today is Ukraine, which is why I've picked it, whose radio games were challenging people on the highest levels of German government at the time, specifically Himmler, which is what that piece was talking about. So it was kind of relevant to me to choose this piece specifically because the Ukraine crisis was kind of in full mode at the time. And as you're aware, and we probably will discuss this later on, there's sort of a minority nationalism in Ukraine that is a very negative nationalism that is attached to either those who fought on the side of the Nazis in World War II or had their own quasi-nationalist bands, but they really went after civilians. And so I wanted to find this exemplar of a ethnic Ukrainian, or at least someone who was born in what today is Ukraine, who was actually, working on the side of the Soviet Union. So I thought this would also kind of, gain more attention to this piece.
Yeah, it's a fascinating read, and like you said, the first thing I thought was this could be some kind of film. And so you talk about the attempt that involved all of these radio games, and that's interesting because I have mentioned or written a few articles about cryptography and ciphers and all this kind of stuff, and how it relates to, especially during the Cold War, number stations. And so here's an actual instance of where people were sending out fake signals, right, to basically produce disinformation. So really, really fascinating stuff. And maybe you want to touch on some of the games and tricks that were used by the radio gamester.
Well, in this particular piece, he was basically pretending to be the agent who was working for the German side, but he was from the Soviet Union, and he was kind of a hardcore criminal who's been very successful in his craft, which is why he was picked, and his wife. So there was, again, kind of this interesting, side story of a romance that would make a good film. And he was basically pretending to be this individual as he was communicating with German command. And Germans were trying to, after the Battle of Moscow failed on their end, they were basically trying to send as many agents as possible into the Soviet rear and spread, all kinds of disinformation and, those kinds of things. So he was basically this young officer from Ukraine on the side of the Red Army. He was basically, throwing them off for a long period of time. And he actually went on to, worked, climbed the career ladder and became very, accomplished in the world of counterintelligence in the Soviet Union. So it's also interesting that it's a totally real story.
Mm-hmm. So Operation Fog was a success.
Right. There's Operation, that was the response to Operation Zeppelin coming from the German side.
Right. And Operation Zeppelin is what produced Jimmy Page and Robert Plant, correct? You get into that? I'm being stupid. But,
I'm not sure about that.
So you also mentioned Otto Skorzeny, and if I recall, he had some weird associations after this of, wasn't he involved in training Mossad? Wasn't he involved in, as well as Reinhard Gehlen? Didn't they go?
I'm not sure if there is a mention to that in this particular article, because it was kind of limited to that, but it definitely mentioned that one operation, and it also mentioned that I believe it was an attempt to assassinate, all three of the Allied leaders in Iran, essentially, which failed. So it kind of tried to intertwine all these different famous spy versus spy operations in one piece.
Right. Yeah, no, I knew that wasn't mentioned in the piece, but it just made me think of that. And so if you're listening and you'd like to check it out, and I will link it below, it's Nina's piece at Espionage History Archive titled Hitler's Plot to Assassinate Stalin. So let's move on to the next piece that I thought was fascinating, because I've dealt with a few books, I've done some book reviews that talk about Arab nationalism. And how the Soviets and Syria, as well as other nations like Egypt, would try to form alliances that would essentially work towards promoting Arab nationalism. And this is in contrast to the Western tendency, although there was, as I understand, according to Miles Copeland, an early period where the West was kind of into Arab nationalism for a while with the Ba'athist Party. And then you have this sort of decision to go instead with the jihad, right, following the British imperial model. So tell us about Mission to Syria and how the beginning of the Russo-Syrian partnership began.
Well, basically this piece was heavily excerpted from the memoirs of a well-known Soviet diplomat, whose last name is Novikov. He started off his career actually in the Middle East, which are the parts that I've picked in Egypt, and he dealt with Syria, Lebanon, And then he actually went on to, even for a brief period, to be the Soviet ambassador in Washington, D.C. And obviously, he was recording certain notes, and eventually this came out as a book. I believe it must have been in the 80s. I don't think something like this could have been published earlier. So once again, in terms of relevance, I thought this would be very interesting to compare and contrast all the different geostrategic interests in the Middle East. So what the piece is about is basically the late period in the Second World War, 1944 to 45, and so this is just, Syria is just about to become independent, and there was a little bit of a parallel between Russia's current actions in Syria and Soviet actions in Syria at the time, where the Syrian government was really looking toward the Soviet Union to back them up in their bid for independence. And so it was kind of interesting to see the descriptions of the French. Obviously, Syria was under French mandate, French and British sort of colliding interests in the Middle East, when at the same time they're allies in, the war that's going on. Right. So kind of interesting to see who the, remaining players are today in the Syrian war theater versus ones that are new. There's, I believe, little to no mention of Washington, and of course, it's after 1945 that U.S. really kind of inherited what Britain was doing prior to that, and just, was able to become a global hegemon. So it was kind of interesting to see that, very little mention of very important regional players today like Saudi Arabia. At the same time, what today is Syria was obviously under Ottomans for a while, and, that influence is mentioned. And of course, we can look at Turkish interests in that region today that, range from funding terrorism to all kinds of other unpleasant things, such as funneling or not funneling a flow of migrants and refugees into Europe. So there's just a lot of parallels, but also some differences that I think are kind of relevant to see in terms of the historic correspondence. And of course, after that, the Soviet Union established a military base in Syria in the 1970s, and has kind of been there on and off. Obviously, Syria is important to, former USSR and today's Russia for geostrategic reasons, the Caspian Basin. Also important to Iran, which is in opposition to places like Turkey and obviously Washington. So there are a lot of kind of intertwined interests going on. But at the same time, no one is going to say that all these countries involved are there for fully altruistic reasons. Right. At the same time, it's very interesting to see the different ways in which they operate, where, today's Russia is doing it through a legal international framework by getting permission of the current government, whereas the so-called Western coalition is essentially bypassing all that and, bombing deserts for a year with no result. So it's definitely very relevant.
I think, I have an idea in my mind, and I'm sure you do as well, as to why Syria is such a big target and why it's constantly in the news. But for the benefit of listeners, and I think immediately of the Oded Yanon plan of Israel to create microstates through breaking up this Middle Eastern region. But there's also, of course, interests that relate to oil and pipelines and things like that.
Right.
So for the benefit of listeners, what would you say if somebody were to just ask, Nina, you're good at this, what is the main reason Syria is such a big deal for the West?
Well, I would say the reasons are multiple, as you've just described them, and today we have multiple players that are there for their own reasons, and I think it would be too simplistic to reduce it to, let's say, the opposition of Washington and Moscow. Mm-hmm. The pipeline issue is definitely an interesting one because many analysts have suggested that Syria would make, great transit zone for Saudi Arabia to import energy into Europe, bypassing other suppliers, Russia being one of the major ones. So immediately you have that confrontation. You have Turkish interests that, of course, are geopolitical, but they're also ideological. Many have talked about the fact that Erdogan kind of sees himself as this neo-sultan who is trying to reinstate the Ottoman Empire in some shape or form, and Syria, of course, was part of it. So all of these things combine into kind of a very complicated picture. I think there was an article, I think last month in the LA Times, where it, we don't know because it's quoting anonymous sources, but it's basically talking, it's basically talking about that the CIA and the Pentagon are funding groups that are opposed to each other. So, I mean, it gets to that level of detail. So I think it's kind of important to look at all the important players.
Yeah, I agree. I don't mean to oversimplify it, but a lot of people who will be listening to this are very geopolitically savvy, but then I think people may not be. But really, what you point out in this article that I think is helpful is that as you said, the present day issues are mirrored back in this period. And so it's a perfect sort of introduction into understanding, what's going on in this region, why it matters, and kind of the power blocks that are involved. And
right.
But it makes me also think of, I love the fact that CNN was caught, a couple of years ago running that whole CNN with Syrian Danny.
Right.
But that was all staged, and so you have to understand that if CNN is going to the extent of taking basically actors and putting them into scenarios and talking about chemical warfare attacks, which make no sense for Assad to engage in chemical attacks on his own people. It's just utterly ridiculous. But what we see is that it's really a bigger game at work here that's involved in, I would say, creating microstates, and that's originally what the British Empire did throughout the Middle East, was carving it all up and basically paying off the king of this or that region.
Yeah, definitely. There's the issue of borders that were essentially established through colonial interests at the time. At the same time, some of these states have lasted for, several decades in that format and were kind of consolidated. And a lot of these people have lived and coexisted in the same landscape. So I think it's a pretty complex issue. The issue of balkanizing Syria is definitely obvious from the so-called peace talks. I mean, if you look at the Russian perspective, they're trying to be as inclusive as possible, obviously excluding obvious terrorist groups, but there's been a lot of pressure to exclude the Kurds, and when you're not including a huge population in peace regulation, that's basically been pushing them toward a more hardcore autonomy, which of course then leads to balkanizing Syria. So it's, that's definitely an issue that's come up. Then of course there are questions of internal, misunderstandings and disagreements in the Arab world, that is, various ethnicities, religious groups, and so forth, some of which are and have been in conflict. So you kind of have Western interests on top of that, which makes it for a very difficult scenario. Also, when you look at how this particular Syrian crisis have started, it kind of followed a pretty standard color revolution scenario. I mean, you can Google headlines. Pardon?
Exactly, I was going to bring up.
You can Google headlines from the summer of 2011 and to remind yourself, and you could see that you had U.S. and French ambassadors attending openly protests in places like Hama. So, which is exactly what they were doing in Ukraine during the Maidan. You had highly positioned diplomats and political officialdom attending protests against the government, which is, in the very least, probably not a way a diplomat should act. So there's definitely that aspect too.
Well, I was going to ask you about that pattern. If we could maybe shift a little bit over to Ukraine, which you've talked quite a bit about. And if you go back to I think the 90s, you had the State Department, Washington, putting a lot of money into the Orange Revolution, and this was, of course, to bring to power the Timoshenko. And so this brought the blonde Princess Leia to power. Well, why don't you tell us about the color revolutions and how that was all kind of set up through a lot of State Department money in the Ukraine, which led us to this present scenario?
Well, Ukraine, as it exists in its post-Soviet state, is a bit of an artificial country with two conflicting identities, one being the minority West facing toward Europe, and the other being the majority East facing or toward Russia, and of course there are a lot of ethnic Russians there as well. So by definition, that makes it very easy to exploit these differences by outside forces. Now, that's not to say that if the Ukrainian government had pursued a more unifying policy, that in 100 years Ukraine couldn't have become a real sort of country with a real national identity that's unifying. But this has not happened. In fact, the opposite came true. Now, in terms of, it's not Ukraine itself that's important to those who oppose the Kremlin, but its relationship with Russia. First, we have the profound cultural, linguistic, ethnic, historic connection going back, over 1,000 years. Then we have the geostrategic aspect where, especially in the Soviet period, a lot of industry, including the space industry, was really synced to work between the two Soviet republics, Ukrainian, the Russian SSR, not to mention agricultural production. And of course, there's the question of energy transit that Ukraine has been used for by Russia to deliver energy into Europe. And obviously with this, this crisis, other projects have started up, like Nord Stream 2, that bypasses all of that. And on top of that, there is the question that's been resolved of access to the Black Sea and Crimea. So it's, if you look at major thinkers from the Washington standpoint, like, Brzezinski, if you look at his famous book, The Grand Chessboard, he talks about the relevance to Ukraine, to Russia. If Russia is friendly with Ukraine, then, as he calls it, Russia remains an empire and exerts global influence. If Russia is, separated from Ukraine, it is reduced at best to being a regional power and has to fully face towards Asia. So you look at, lots of pieces by think tanks, prominent think tanks in Washington, like Stratfor,
yes,
and, its founder.
Brookings Institute and all that. They talk
right.
about this.
So you prominently have these positions discussed. So as you've mentioned, this is something that was being exploited starting from the collapse of the Soviet Union. The State Department alone, on an official level, invested $5 billion into what it calls creation of a civil society in Ukraine. And that's not even talking about all these other organizations that sometimes play for themselves, sometimes not, like, Soros's Open Society that has been very active and very supportive of the initial Maidan. So this is kind of like one of the mistakes of the Russian government, because instead of investing into cultural institutions, media, public, opinion makers, and so forth, it basically just invested in the elites and provided cheap energy to Ukraine. That I think it learned too late that this is not the right approach. So basically, you've created this. As you've mentioned, this was not the first Maidan. There was the Orange Revolution in the 2000s, and it kind of, built up toward what happened in 2013, 2014. And, when you create a class of people who are promoting minority ideas to majority of the people, there's, a very powerful propaganda campaign that can affect opinion.
Yeah.
And you have all this, finance. And of course, you're doing this under the banner of nice, vague comments about European values and facing Europe and so forth. And then, at the same time, you have the undercurrent of these, self-described fascistic elements that kind of acted as the stormtroopers and made the entire situation very violent. If you'd like, I can go back to the history of Russia and Ukraine as, the same geopolitical, geographic entity that goes back,
if I recall, wasn't it post World War I where this was kind of divvied up as it is in the present form?
Basically, there are no mentions of Ukraine, and the word Ukraine, Ukraina, comes from Okraina, which means the outskirts, so it's almost derogatory. Mm-hmm. Basically, Ukraine, if you look at even, the various censuses from the late Russian Empire, there's no mention of Ukrainians. There's mentions of Great Russians, Velikoruсы, and Little Russians, which maybe sounds a little, derogatory, but it's not meant to be. Malorosy, which are people populating eastern Ukraine. So basically, when the Bolsheviks took over, they had to maintain control over this vast land that was once the Russian Empire with a radically different social and political order. So one of the ways they tried to do this was by instituting various administrative regional sections to the country, and they would really divide things, looking at it now in an artificial way. So, for instance, Lenin, being, kind of a traditional Marxist in a way, opposed what he called Great Russian chauvinism. So he decided to reduce that influence by attaching regions that were ethnically Russian, and that is today's Donbass, where the frozen or not so frozen conflict is going on, to what became the Ukrainian Soviet Socialist Republic. Mm-hmm. Then during World War II, you had Stalin attaching these western lands that have historically been under Austria-Hungary. And then, of course, the famous gift of 1954, Khrushchev gives Crimea, that is, 98% ethnically Russian, to Ukraine. So really these, what seemed like, simple administrative decisions, turned into a little bit of a, slow timed bomb that kind of exploded, in, the recent past.
Yeah, I wanted to ask you, I wrote a piece a couple years ago in 2014, May, right when a lot of this was sort of hitting the news. Mm-hmm. And what I noticed right away was the similarity between what happened in Russia in the 90s, which you wrote a good piece about, kind of firsthand, your account mm-hmm. of what you saw, and what happens here in the Ukraine with the IMF plan that comes in to loot the whole place. Right. Would you agree that that assessment is pretty much correct, that you kind of have that shock doctrine approach where you kind of wreck things and then you come in as the savior with the billions in $17 billion offered by the IMF to Ukraine mm-hmm. if they'll sign on to all these these Western deals, which really just allows the Western banking establishment to loot the country?
Correct. In terms of this being a rough model of what happened to Russia in the 1990s, that's a pretty accurate assessment. That piece that I wrote about Russia was, normally I try to be very rational and objective and remove myself from the situation. That particular piece perhaps sounded a little bit more emotional because I was actually, there, and that eventually turned to be the reason a part of my family immigrated, and we've been kind of separated ever since. So I had kind of a direct connection to what was going on. Essentially you had a collapse, you had an economic collapse that is described in certain, controversial collapses books of the day. You, at the same time, had an introduction of a really kind of wild version of capitalism. There was a very popular expression in Russia at the time, if you're so smart, then why are you so poor? So, this basically targeted people who were trained in, engineering or medicine, who were poor because the state no longer supported them, versus people who, let's say, would travel to Poland, would buy track pants and sell them in Russia, who were now smart because they're making money. So it kind of took really ugly forms. IMF essentially, and, Western advisors, essentially ran Russia in that entire period.
Right.
Under Yeltsin, who frequently took vacations to his cottage outside of Moscow to drink, as we all know. So, this created a whole class of these oligarchs that went from rags to riches within, literally a couple of years. A lot of Western investors profited beyond belief, which is some of them are currently, which is why some of them are currently criticizing Putin, because he put a stop to that. Something like Hermitage Capital, for instance, with Browder, went from a very, small investment to like billions and billions in like literally 2 years. So, yeah, I mean, then you had, huge devaluation of currency where people just completely lost all their savings, and so on and so forth, with all the, social ails that came with, newly introduced heavy drugs, abortion skyrocketing, divorce and so forth, death exceeding births, and just, demographic collapse. I mean, it is kind of amazing that Russia...
You've been listening to my interview with Nina Kouprianova. If you like what you hear, to hear the full interview, go to jaysanalysis.com and subscribe at the PayPal link for $4.95 a month, where you get access to my full interviews, lectures, and talks that cover a diverse amount of subject matter. Also, check out my book, Esoteric Hollywood, which can be ordered through Trine Day Publishers. You'll see the links there for the book, as well as Jamie Hanshaw's book, Hollywood Mind Control. So thank you for listening.